They call him Johnny Rock and Roll. They call him Johnny Rock and Roll. They call him Johnny Rock and Roll. He gets you hot if you're cold.
Listen all day and all night.
Eat the steak and then get a pen.
Oh, gnarly!
Hey everybody out there in Radio Land, your buddy Johnny Rock here. Today we have a very special guest joining us here on Johnny Rock and Roll Radio. Her name is Laurie Kaye, and she has a new book coming out called Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper. Hi Laurie Kaye, how's things going?
Going well, thank you. How are you?
Well, is that a question or a greeting?
Greeting.
Well, great then. Thanks for asking. I have to share something with everyone before we get started. On December 8th, 1980, I was in the military and was on board a plane heading from New Orleans to Hawaii. I was listening to the radio via my boombox and headphones when I heard the news that John Lennon had been assassinated. I immediately told a flight attendant who then told the pilot, who then made an announcement over the loudspeaker. It's truly a day that I would never forget. For you, that day was both the best day of your life and the worst day of your life. Before we get into that, tell us exactly, who is Laurie Kaye?
I'm a SoCal gal, born and bred, and although I've lived everywhere around the world, including Bali in Indonesia, New Zealand, you name it, I'm back in LA because it's my favorite place. And even though I've been on the air in cities from Omaha to Seattle to San Francisco, I'm in LA. I'm not on the radio anymore, but I was a radio newscaster and anchor for the RKO station KFRC AM, which was not just a top 40 station, but the top 40 station in the country back for the few years when I was there. Billboard magazine just referred to it as the best, and it was. And it was amazing because I started out there as an intern in the newsroom. I had just turned 20, and I was a student in journalism at UC, University of California, Berkeley. And I was going to take an internship, I thought, at a major newspaper to be a news writer. But since I was very last minute in looking for it, all the big ones like the New York Times were all already taken up by interns. So I took the first thing I could find, and it just so happened that KFRC was looking for a newsroom intern. They'd never had one before. I got the gig, and not only that, but after several weeks on the job, I got the job offer to be their news editor, and that eventually turned into reporter and on the air after I had to go work, be on the air at a number of other stations just to make sure I was qualified to be on the air at the best top 40 station in the country. And I did, and I was. And the amazing thing was, once I started, it was incredible because I realized I loved writing for radio. And because it was just like talking, I could have long sentences, and it was great. It was much better for me than writing for print, actually. So my talent was recognized, and the minute I got the job as the news editor, I also got an immediate offer from Dave Sholin, who was head of the music department at KFRC and eventually an RKO executive and the co-conductor of the John Lennon interview with me. He offered me the opportunity to write what turned out to be the country's longest Beatles special. It was for RKO, called RKO Presents the Beatles, and it was originally 14 hours, but by the time it was syndicated and a couple of years after it aired on RKO stations, it was amazingly, we expanded it to just about 17 hours, went 15 to 17. And I got to change the title to the title I had first come up with, which was The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend. And it's still what I think an amazing special. Ron Hummel, who was the creative and technical producer, did an amazing job. It's terrific. This is the cover of one of the original reel-to-reels from the RKO special, which we finished writing and producing in 1977 and aired also for the first time in 77 on all the RKO stations.
Wow. For you folks listening to my radio, you wait till you see the video, when the video version of this when it comes out, because you can basically see what Laurie Kaye is holding up, and you'll be able to see her rocking background. In fact, David Bowie is photobombing you. So you mentioned reporter, journalist, editor, like all those different titles and stuff. What's the difference between a reporter and a journalist?
Well, the reporter is on radio, somebody who comes up with stories, does interviews, writes the stories, maybe gives them to the newscaster to read, or sometimes reads them themselves. I went from being editor to reporter to newscaster. And then the whole time while I was doing that, which was a full-time job, I also was pretty much RKO's sole rock special writer and often co-producer. So, and definitely interviewer. I interviewed lots of wonderful rock stars, and it was just the most amazing time of my life. And especially even when I went to go to be on the air at other stations. For example, I would get a call out of the blue from Dave Sholin, who would say, "So, Laurie, do you think you might want to go to London with me and interview Paul McCartney?" And it's like, yes. How soon? Let me get out of here right away.
Yeah, I don't think my shoes on.
Yeah, I left Seattle and came right back, and off we went. It was great.
And so, and how old were you when he called? They called 21, maybe.
No, that was in 79. So I was 24.
Okay, right on. Now, so that's when you get the title of the eligibility of being a name dropper. So let's talk about first your book, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper. And then is it called a tag?
Yes, it's Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview. And it's the story of my early life and career wrapped around December 8th, 1980, which was tragically what turned out to be John Lennon's last day on the planet. And I unbelievably was able to spend a major part of that day with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, which still to this day is amazing to me.
So there's so much to talk about because, with all the other celebrities, but the fact that this was his last day on Earth, and there's so many questions that people want to know and that I want to know. First, and this is maybe should be the last one, but Scott Innes, the voice of Scooby-Doo, he wants to know that, knowing what you know now, that it would be that it was his last day on Earth, and you were talking to him just hours prior to his assassination. Would you have asked different questions or done anything differently?
Well, I would have loved to have talked further about the Beatles, to have just come out and asked about his days with the Beatles and breaking up with the Beatles and everything. But I was unable to do that because we were told from the very beginning by our Warner Brothers Geffen executive, Bert Keane, who was with us, not to mention the past, that John was interested in talking about the present, not looking back at the past. Now, the amazing thing was that during the interview, John did bring up Paul McCartney, and he did bring up the Beatles, several times, but I had to be very conscious, as we all did, about bringing it up ourselves, because just prior to our interview, John had done an interview with Playboy magazine, and the writer had made a point of asking questions, and John got you could tell he was pretty pissed off about it. And I didn't want that to happen. The last thing I wanted was for John Lennon to be upset with me about anything or anything. So I think actually what we asked and how we asked it was really fine. And I still listen back to that interview and feel like we covered so much of what I wanted to know. And especially things that we didn't even ask that John just came up with. It was amazing.
Right. It's I guess not really odd at all. But most of the questions that I had received from not only listeners, but people in the industry, entertainment industry, most of their questions were having to be Beatles related, except for mine. I have a lot of personal, like what did John Lennon smell like? That's what I want to know. Did he smell like, did he smell like essential oil or flowers or peace or marijuana?
Well, none of that. He actually, no, he just smelled like a great guy, to the point where I wouldn't have noticed unless he was smelling bad or odd or, like some kind of weird fragrance. But he didn't. He was a regular guy. That was the amazing thing. And his sense of humor was so amazing as well, that's what really caught up with me from the start all the way to the finish.
Yeah, and it lasted over 2 hours. I happened to listen to, I mentioned it to you, I found something, and I don't think it's legal, or it's not even supposed to be online, but it says it's the unedited edition of your interview with him, and it starts off with 30 minutes of you guys and Yoko, and then he comes down, but then it gets cut off abruptly at the end after he's exchanging gifts and y'all giving them gifts. Is that really all of it, or is there more?
Well, actually, we were at the Dakota well over 4 hours.
Okay.
Waiting, in the assistant's office and everything for everything to start up. And then at the end, when the tapes were done and sitting around and talking, and no, nothing on YouTube that you've listened to is the entire interview. They're all missing tapes. And that's definitely something that's been told to me by Ron Hummel, our creative and technical producer and engineer that day as well. And also, not everything was recorded. So things are missing. And, that's why my book has more details and more quotes than can necessarily be found in the interview that you hear.
Yeah, right on. Now, so let me run some of these questions by you, if that's okay. One of them was, of course, this is from our executive producer, Mike Kramer. He actually wanted to know what John's mood was like and his reaction to talking about the Beatles. Like you said, you can kind of answer part of that, but you didn't talk about what was his attitude, his mood towards it. Obviously, he brought it up, so he was cool with it.
Well, he was in a pretty great mood, which was something that I was really concerned about walking in, because I know that he, could very possibly find us, I don't know, just like a regular interview, boring or something. And I didn't want that to happen. But he actually was quite wonderful. And the most amazing thing to me was that how he validated me all throughout the time I was there. And as a child who grew up in a non-supportive, dysfunctional family, validation was not something I was necessarily used to. And so to have John Lennon sitting next to me on a love seat, and every time he particularly agreed with or approved or loved something I said, he would take his finger and slip his glasses down his nose and stare at me in a typical John Lennon fashion and say, "Yes, love, exactly," or "You hit the nail right on the head." So that to me was being in an incredible mood, no matter what we were talking about.
And I have a question for you. Is there anything that came to mind? Well, first off, immediately afterwards, like right after you got finished and you parted ways, or anything like, "Oh, I should have asked him." And so it was immediately, because there's got to be something after, but immediately after, was there anything?
Well, I need to say that towards the end of our interview, all of us, the team of four of us from RKO and the record company, and John and Yoko made plans to get together in a couple of weeks when John and Yoko were going to be on the West Coast in San Francisco. We were all going to get together for dinner. So anything that I wanted to talk to him about, like the two of our experiences on Bali and asking Yoko about relationship clues and that, how to have a great relationship sort of thing, that just, it made me think, well, we're going to be longtime friends here, so I can always keep talking to him, and there will probably always be interviews. So there was really nothing I regretted not asking. And even afterwards, even after the tragedy, I still felt that we had covered, just about what we needed to as far as the interview. I mean, personally, I would have loved to talk to John about his family. And had we stayed friends, had he stayed alive, I would have, because he had similar family issues to me, and not being raised by his mother pretty much. And I really felt that we related on so many levels. That was one of them.
Right on. Well, I can certainly relate there too. So we're all connected. But I did notice from what I heard that it sounded like in that amount of time, you really get to know somebody, because not only are you asking questions, but you're seeing the mannerisms. And so what was your first impression of Yoko as an individual? Because I know she, you spent time with her before him. And was this the first time you met Yoko?
Yes, it was the first time I met Yoko. And I had always been fascinated by her.
Okay.
And her conceptual art and her early music and music, when she ended up with John, it was just so interesting to me, and I wanted to know more about her. And when I was still a student at UC Berkeley, I stopped at a famous bookstore one day, Cody's bookstore on Telegraph Avenue. And there in the front of the store was a table with bargain books on it. And there was a copy of Yoko Ono's Grapefruit, which I wanted, but I couldn't afford before. But suddenly I could afford it. So I bought the 1970 version of her 1964 book and was thrilled, and had no idea, of course, that within 5 years, not only would I be sitting down with her in her office, but I'd be waiting for her former Beatle husband to join us. It was amazing. So that was exceptional.
Okay, yeah, I imagine so. And recording artist Carolyn Cato wants to know, what was the last question you asked him, and what was the answer? The very last question.
I'm trying to remember. I can't really put them all in an order necessarily, but I can remember the very last thing that we talked about, which was that copy of Grapefruit that I had bought, I brought with me. And John and Yoko were both thrilled because they hadn't seen it in years. Nobody had a copy, and I guess they hadn't looked at whatever copy they might have had. So not only did Yoko say, "Oh, I look forward to autographing it for you," but John, who'd written the introduction to the book, and it said so on the cover right under Yoko's beautiful photograph, he said, "Laurie, can I autograph your book as well?" And I said, "Yes, please, of course." And not only did he autograph, but he did an amazing cartoon of him and Yoko, the one he wanted to draw. And not only that, but afterwards, when I thanked him, he said, "Oh, well, I'm just like everybody else. When somebody gives me a book, I love it when they autograph it." And so I immediately said, "Well, that's good to hear, because when I come out with my book, I'll definitely, send you an autographed copy." And he said, "Great." And so that was my first, major excitement about writing a book. And that was nearly 43 years ago. And now my book is coming out this year. So it's taken me quite a while, because I've had all kinds of guilt and everything else to deal with. not to mention being busy with work. But that was possibly the very last thing we talked about.
What I loved was how adamant he was that he would not stop until that autograph was perfect. Because I think there was an issue with the ink pen or something, so you wanted to make sure there was an indenture too. Did something like that happen?
Well, we had so many pens and markers with us, and John and Yoko had some in the office as well. And almost everyone we tried to use for them to sign autographs on the Double Fantasy albums and a poster that somebody had brought. And my book actually was the one with the perfect autograph, but everything else was problem causing. And even my copy of Double Fantasy, had to be signed they tried to sign it like 3 different times at least, because
Wow.
we had issues.
Yeah, well, see, I noticed that he wasn't frustrated or aggravated at all about it, really. He made comments about it, but he made sure he didn't give up. In other words, he wanted to make sure y'all got what y'all wanted, and that was great. What about the apartment? Before we go further, what about the apartment itself? I mean, walking into John and Yoko's apartment alone is like, if I would have just delivered a pizza there, I would have been, that would have been a highlight of my life. Well, I stood in the doorway and waited. So what was that like? Just walking in was like a museum, or?
Well, I have to clarify that when we came to the Dakota, the first time we spent was quite a while in the front office that his assistants had, while they told us that John and Yoko were busy upstairs in their apartment taking photographs for Rolling Stone with Annie Leibovitz, which I have to admit freaked me out, because I had had a horrifying experience with Annie Leibovitz myself just couple of years before when I was in Seattle, and that story's in my book. But as I figured, well, as long as I don't have to see her, I'll be fine here. But anyway, so they said it's going to be a while till they're done, and they eventually showed us into the office, their private office, which was technically primarily Yoko's office, because she's the one who basically did all the work for the family business. And so we went in there, and it was much like an apartment, but it wasn't their apartment. Their apartment was upstairs. We walked in, and the first thing I saw as we opened the door was this amazingly incredible white shag carpeting, which we, of course, were asked to take our shoes off to walk on. And all I could think of was, oh, I wish I was barefoot. That would be amazing. So soft. And we walked in, and we saw the grand piano, the beautiful white grand piano, and desks, and there were phones on the desk, which rang throughout the interview, because back in the day, they couldn't seem to turn off the phone, the assistants. And also, the most amazing thing to me was right in front of the love seat, there was this coffee table, and it was huge, long glass coffee table with metal legs, and up the legs were snakes. Metal snakes way up each of the legs. And I was just overwhelmed by it. And throughout the entire interview, I would keep looking down at it thinking, am I really here? Am I really seeing this? And yes, I was. And yes, I did. So it was incredible. And even though we weren't actually in their apartment, because even though Yoko finally came down, and she did say that John was going to be spending a little bit longer taking solo photos with Annie Leibovitz, I was pretty glad that we weren't going up to their apartment almost, because I didn't want to see her,
Yeah.
So that's when we started talking with Yoko. And actually, I think Yoko was really sort of excited to see that I was there on the otherwise all-male team. So she could relate to me as a woman as well, and probably figured that I would understand a lot of what she was saying maybe not more, but faster than maybe the guys would have. And so it was great. So I started talking to her immediately about double fantasy and what she had hoped for, to in terms of telling women and men how to improve their relationships, and as she and John had done, just several years before when they got back together. So that was really wonderful. And the guys joined in, and Yoko enjoyed talking to all of us. And there we were, talking, when all of a sudden the door of the private office started to open just a crack. And I looked, and there was John's nose coming through the crack, and I could see his glasses. And being the smart ass that I am, the first thing I said, which fortunately wasn't recorded because people probably would have hated me, was I looked at him and said, "Smart ass, can't you tell we're in the middle of an interview?" John laughed and came in, and I thought to myself, this is a great sign. It's going to be an incredible day. And it was.
Yeah, right on. So it's difficult to talk. It's got to be very difficult for you, because it's difficult for me to talk about. You were there, so and I'm sure people ask you all the time. But when you heard the news about what happened, that changed everything. As far as like, was it supposed to be a radio interview or an article?
Well, it was definitely going to be a radio interview that was for RKO, and it was going to be airing in February on Valentine's Day, because Double Fantasy was a love album. So we thought, okay, well, in 2 months, the album will be aired a lot, and people will be familiar with it, and then we can do the special in February. And of course, that wasn't what happened. It had to air 2 days after the interview, or several days after the interview. It took me 2 days after the interview to write it. And then Dave Sholin voiced it, and Ron technically and creatively produced it. So it aired the Sunday after December 8th, which is when John was shot and killed. And the amazing thing is that I still listen to that interview by itself, and I listened to this special, John Lennon, The Man, the Memory, and it still makes me feel horrified and guilty in so many ways. I have felt guilty, and still do, for years, because of my contact after the interview with the freak who turned out to be the assassin. And that's something that unfortunately will probably never leave my life. Right.
When I think about that, I can imagine that you probably have flashbacks. I can't imagine. My heart goes out to you.
Thank you.
Again, you can't fake goosebumps like that. So that literally changed your life overnight. You did some writing. What do they call it? Ghost writing, where you don't get the credit for what you're writing.
Correct. Yes.
Did that was that before the John Lennon interview or after?
You're talking about Dick Clark. Well, what happened is that I had actually left my newscaster job on KFRC before the Lennon interview and joined another company called Drake Chenault that was famous for basically being the ones to come up with top 40 radio back in the 60s. And what I was doing for them was writing a radio special that called SatCon 1. That was a 48-hour special, and unlike anything else that had ever aired. And even though it wasn't particularly something that I was fascinated by and hadn't come up with the concept myself, I was happy to take a job, a full-time job, doing a rock radio special. So I moved back to LA and took that job, and still kept doing freelance work for RKO. And one of the very first freelance things was the John Lennon interview, which worked out amazingly well in terms of timing, because the show that I'd been writing for Drake Chenault had already aired. So it wasn't like they missed me while I was gone. And while I was still in New York for the 2 days, I was the one who spent the night after the interview in New York. The guys from RKO and the record company all flew back to the West Coast that evening. But I stayed, and I was there to meet a friend of mine for dinner. And when we went back to his apartment afterwards, as he opened the door of his new apartment, he said, "Oh, I left my radio on, so in case anybody broke in while we were gone, hopefully they would think somebody was home and they would turn around and leave and go elsewhere." And I thought that was kind of funny. But all of a sudden, when he opened the door, the radio we heard was a reporter saying that John Lennon had been shot after coming home from the recording studio. And he was currently at Roosevelt Hospital. And I almost fainted right off the bat. I ran out into the middle of the street right away, grabbed a cab, and took it to Roosevelt Hospital. And when I got there, I looked through the big glass door in front, and there was Yoko hanging on to what I assumed was a close friend, and crying hysterically. And just looking at her, what I wanted to do was go in and soothe her, but I realized, oh my God, John wasn't just shot. This means he's been fatally shot. And I knew it before it was even announced to the public hours later that that's what had happened. So I immediately went to the phone booth and called the RKO Radio Network headquarters in New York and said, "Here's what I believe that has happened." And they had me come to their offices immediately. And I stayed up all night and did interviews for stations and press all over the country and all over the world. And then the next morning was on the Today Show. And meanwhile, the guys who were on their airplane going back to the West Coast didn't find out about John getting shot or getting killed for hours until they landed. And so I felt, I believe, worse because I was the only one of the four of our team that knew, and I couldn't talk to them about it, or,
Yeah.
It was just so very sad for me. And then after that, after I was on the Today Show, I immediately flew back to the West Coast, spent the next 2 days writing the special, John Lennon, The Man, the Memory. And I couldn't immediately go back to work. I was just so horrified and guilty and just felt terrible. And so I basically just kind of hung out in my apartment for, the while. And I did have some interviews scheduled with RKO shortly after that I couldn't really cancel, that needed to be conducted. One was with Neil Diamond, and one was with Barry Manilow, and then one coming up with Devo. And I had to do those. And it just, being in music and in radio just was never the same for me. It was almost like I didn't want to. And I started getting a lot of job offers, but I had trouble even wanting to take any. I did, because of course I had to earn a living, but it was very difficult for me. And possibly the greatest was maybe 2 years later, when I got the job with Dick Clark, writing not only his weekly countdown show, but he asked me, because he liked my writing so much, to be the ghostwriter of his nationally syndicated weekly newspaper articles. And so I did that. And that was a lot
really cool. I would just say that's really cool.
He also asked me to write a book for him, but I was planning on moving to New York. So I didn't think I would have the time, so I didn't do that. But I did have a wonderful experience working for Dick and not pretending to be him, but him as I went to concerts and writing about them as if Dick Clark had been there, like the US Festival or the filming of 3 nights for the Talking Heads movie, and that sort of thing. So it was a great opportunity.
That's really cool. You had mentioned, and that's what I meant about change your life as far as like career, because you went from being a journalist and reporter to being the interviewee. You were now being interviewed left and right. So that was how did you was that hard for you? Well, you said it was hard to talk about, but was it hard to be center of attention all of a sudden?
Well, I was used to sitting in an interview situation, so it wasn't that hard.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
Except when I had to talk about that day all the time, that did make it difficult. But to be very honest, I did keep doing interviews for quite a while. And even though I went into TV production, I still did interviews. I produced video music magazines years later in the early 90s for BMG and everything from country music video magazine to the heavy metal video magazine, Metalhead, and that sort of thing. So I was doing more interviews and more production, and it was all sort of growth from that, and it was a wonderful career that I had.
Yeah, and it still is. I see a movie coming, and you're a casting director too, so you can be the casting director for your own. Let me get you. I want to send you my headshot and resume, okay? I play younger also. It's the same thing as, the interviews. I don't want to go in that route either, because I want to talk more about your book and some of the other legendary interviews you've had. I mean, just being in I'm not referring to a starstruck attitude, because if you act starstruck, they're gonna act like a superstar. But being in the presence of, like, for instance, Little Richard, what was that like? Little Richard, the queen of rock and roll. Was that backstage? Tell us about that interview, if you don't mind.
No, it was actually in his manager's apartment, and it was amazing. It was for a print article that I was writing for Rock magazine, and it was when Little Richard Penniman's book came out, The Life and Times of Little Richard, the Quasar of Rock, which I got an advanced copy of, and of course he autographed it for me on that day. And he was wonderful to talk to, and told great stories about the Beatles, about the Rolling Stones, about Michael Jackson, Prince, everybody who had been a huge fan of his and got to perform with him at some time or meet him or whatever. And the Beatles, who he performed with early on, he told a great story about Paul McCartney, which is in my book, how Paul was so excited to meet him. And at one point when Little Richard was playing, he threw his shirt out into the audience for a woman to get. And Paul McCartney was so amazed that he went backstage and got one of his shirts and gave it to Little Richard. And it just made him, crazy happy to be able to do that. So all kinds of stories like that were great. And another thing that Little Richard talked about was Elvis Presley, because Little Richard felt that he was the king of rock and roll and had been. And since he was a songwriter, he deserved to be more than Elvis Presley, who didn't write songs. So he talked a lot about that too. But one of the craziest things, talking to Little Richard, was he had just recently become a priest. He'd taken training and done that. And we had gotten along so well during this lengthy interview that he said to me, "Laurie, if you're planning to get married anytime soon, let me know. I'll marry you. I'll be your officiant." And I said, "Great." But I didn't get married for years. And when I finally did and contacted him, he let me know that he wasn't doing that anymore. It was just something that he wasn't planning on doing. So I had to get a substitute. And my substitute ended up being Mojo Nixon, whose song I loved, Elvis is Everywhere. And he ended up being the officiant, non-religious officiant, of course, on my first marriage. So that was pretty fun. And it all came from an interview. So that was typical of what would happen to me during interviews. They were great.
Well, that's awesome. That's a great story. And it's a story that you can't tell without name dropping. You know,
I'm a name dropper.
It is what it is. You can't tell the story correctly unless you name drop. You gotta mention it. It's part of it. When you mentioned Palmer, and again, it's stories that they just keep. It's like a domino effect. You mentioned Cherokee. I think of Cher, whatever. But you mentioned Paul McCartney, that's a whole other story in itself. So tell us a little story about. Can you just read the book to us?
I wish I could give you a book reading, but what I can do instead is refer you to my book's new website, which is confessionsofarockandrollnamedropper.com, because there's a live reading of my introductory first chapter in that book. So that will give you an idea of where the book goes. Although there are 17 chapters in the book, and I only do the live reading of the first one, it's still pretty interesting, I think, and will give you an idea of what's to come. So the Paul McCartney interview was great, and it was in June of 1979, but it was actually after I'd already done a solo phoner with George Harrison in the end of 78, right before his self-titled album came out. He was mastering it at the time, and I was interviewing him because I was also writing an RKO show called Top 100 of the 70s, which George had songs on, so I needed to talk to him about that. And I did. And so many other things. And he had just become a new father, and he had just gotten married, and he was so full of love. And it was a wonderful interview. And just after that, I got a call when I was still in Seattle from Dave Sholin saying, would you like to come to London to interview Paul McCartney and the latest lineup of Wings and Linda McCartney with me? And I said, yes, and immediately left my job in Seattle and worked towards preparing for the Paul McCartney interview. And I had never been to England before, so that was very exciting as well. And that turned into a great experience. And Paul was incredible. And so was Linda. She was a lovely, lovely woman. And it's so sad to think of her not being with us anymore.
Yeah.
But Paul was funny. He had an amazing sense of humor, as did John Lennon, of course. And, we had wonderful discussion, not just about songs and life and what was coming up in the future, but we also had the ability to smoke marijuana with Paul and Linda McCartney and the rest of the band, which both Dave Sholin and Ron Hummel and I did, because all I could think of was, wow, if somebody had told me when I was in elementary school that one day I would be smoking pot with Paul McCartney, I would have never believed them. And it happened.
So Paul McCartney does smell like marijuana. Okay.
We all did.
That's enough. Just that story alone is an awesome story. That's like Smoking on the Bus with Willie. Outside of the John Lennon and Yoko interview, what is your most favorite and most fun? Second to the Lennon interview.
I don't know that I could name what was the most fun and favorite, because they were all great. One of the ones that I loved was interviewing the Ramones, because they're all gone. They're not with us anymore, unfortunately. And they were my favorite punk band at the time. And to be able to interview them back in 1977 and say to them, where did punk come from? And get answers from them. And it was wonderful. And not only that, but Dave Sholin, I invited him into the studio where we were having our interview at KFRC. And he told them that I was amazing because I had been responsible for the RKO Presents the Beatles special. And the Ramones were thrilled. And who would have thought the Ramones would be thrilled by hearing, what I'd done about the Beatles? But they were, because they were into bands, everything from pop to heavy metal to you name it, when they were growing up and even then. So that was an incredible interview.
Right on. Now, you mentioned 1977. There was something that happened in 1977 that during your career, you want to share that? Do you know what I'm referring to?
Well, that was when Elvis Presley died.
Yes. What happened on that day, August 16th, 1977? Where were you?
I was in the newsroom at KFRC. I was a news editor, and I was alone in the newsroom because everybody else, all the newscasters and the news director, had gone out to lunch. And I was sitting there, and all of a sudden, all of the AP and UPI machines started ringing and chiming, and paper started pouring out. And I thought, oh my God, must be a big story. What's going on? And I got up from my desk and I went over and picked up the first paper I found. And it said that Elvis had been declared dead. And I was horrified because I was an Elvis fan. And I immediately ripped the paper off and ran into the disc jockey booth at the station. And the disc jockey announced it, right away. So we became, I believe, the very first station in San Francisco to mention Elvis Presley's passing. And it was so horrifying to me, and I felt so bad. And the very weird thing was, I had an interview the next week during my vacation from KFRC to go to Florida to talk to the people at the National Enquirer who had contacted me to see if I wanted to come be a writer for them. And although I didn't, I took the free trip to Florida because I figured, well, it's a vacation, and, how long can the interview take? And I was talking to the main editor, and he said, so of course, about Elvis Presley dying. And I said, well, yes, of course, and told him how I had been in the newsroom. And he said, well, what would you write about if you were at the National Enquirer? How would you do it differently than anybody else, any other press? And he said, before I could even answer, let me show you something, but don't tell anybody because it's not going to air for or be on the press for another few days. And he took out of his desk a picture of Elvis Presley in the coffin, which horrified me because they had obviously bribed somebody at the funeral home to take that picture and sell it to them. And it was disgusting. And for years, this bothered me. And all of my interviews with George Harrison, with Paul McCartney, with John Lennon, we talked about Elvis passing and how they had all been fans of Elvis and loved his music and his voice and everything. So that still sticks with me to this day.
Wow. Have you ever sat down and just kind of, do you have a log or a record of everybody that you've ever interviewed? Well,
not really. I mean, I remember all of the big ones, but I've done so many that I don't think. I mean, I can name a ton of them for you, but
do that. Can you do that?
Well, months before I interviewed John, I interviewed George Martin, their producer, and that was amazing because that was in relation to the book that he had just published, All You Need Is Ears, and I loved talking to George Martin. He was amazing, and that was one of the best interviews I've ever done. And also, I loved interviewing Paul Kantner. I loved interviewing Grace Slick, both of them from Jefferson Airplane and Jefferson Starship, and they'd had a romantic relationship, of course, and a daughter together, but I interviewed them separately and then interviewed Grace again, not for radio, but for print. And I loved the title I came up with for the article for Rock Magazine, which was What Makes Slick Tick. So that was a lot of fun. And Talking Heads were an amazing interview when they were a brand new band right before their very first performance in San Francisco. That was also back in 1977, right around the same time as the Ramones interview. Then Barry Manilow, Neil Diamond, Devo, Mick Jagger, David Bowie. Mick and David Bowie were both phone interviews because I had to get comments for that special I was writing, Top 100 of the 70s. And it was really funny because I was never told when they would call me to be interviewed. And so I would just be sitting there just before doing one of my newscasts. And all of a sudden, the receptionist would say over the loudspeaker all across the station, Laurie Kaye, Mick Jagger's on the phone for you. And I was sure it was scam. I didn't believe it. So I pick up the phone and say, yeah. And it was Mick Jagger. And the same thing with David Bowie. So those were wild interviews on the phone. And I'm a huge David Bowie fan to this day and miss him incredibly. And he's probably one of the artists I've seen the most out of any rock stars, seen him live. So, that to me still has a big place in my heart.
How would you describe David Bowie?
Polite, kind, sweet, honest, cheerful. He was just wonderful to talk to. And I wish, that we'd been able to set up an in-person interview before long, but unfortunately that never happened. So that's very sad. But like I said, I've seen him live in concert more times than probably anybody else. So that was amazing. And other people I've interviewed, Little Richard, Willie Dixon, Buddy Guy. I'm a huge blues fan as well. And a lot of country artists, because I produced Country Music Video Magazine, everybody from Clint Black to Alan Jackson, Garth Brooks, Marty Stewart, Vince Gill, you name it. I've interviewed them and lots more. And Deep Purple I interviewed, and Roger Glover was great. And Grateful Dead guitarist Bob Ware, and Police, Andy Summer, and
dang.
Just so many more that I can't even remember, to be very honest.
On and on and on. And so your book, and when is it coming out? Did you say
it will be out in December of this year?
Is it spanning your whole career up to now?
It's actually primarily my early career. I do mention things that have happened more recently, but it basically talks about how I built up my early career that led to that interview, my ability to interview John Lennon.
So this is going to be like the pilot for the TV series. I'm telling you, I'm seeing it. So I want to thank you so much for being on Johnny Rock and Roll Radio, and tell everybody one more time. Can they pre-order the book? Did we say that?
Absolutely. If they go to the website, confessionsofrockandrollnamedropper.com, there is a contact page, and there's pre-order through the publisher, and it will be available through them. And then, of course, available on Amazon, and hopefully in plenty of bookstores as well. And I'll be doing more live readings and book signing events. And
right on. Well, definitely let me know if you head down here towards New Orleans. I know you've been down here before.
Yes, I have. I've lived there too. And what I also wanted to tell you was that my book, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, my life leading up to John Lennon's last interview, is basically Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, as well as my memoir, because all of those played a big part in my life.
Rock and roll. Did you dig that, baby?